Conversation, brought to you by Gatopardo and Arizona State University's Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication. My name is Mia Armstrong. I'm a journalist, a Cronkite graduate, and I work at Arizona State University, where I coordinate projects with partners in Mexico. I'm one of the collaborators behind Simbiosis, an innovative alliance between Cronkite and Gatopardo aimed at strengthening narrative journalism in the Americas. Today's conversation is the final in Symbiosis's series of 8 public chats. We hope that you've already enjoyed our other conversations, and if you'd like to watch them all, you can do so on Gatopardo's YouTube channel. Next up, Simbiosis will host a hands-on workshop this spring and an on-site residency program for select journalists, which will be held at Gatopardo facilities in the Yucatan Peninsula in summer 2022. In today's conversation, we'll be discussing how to cover the environment, and more specifically, the ocean. How can we narrate the complex ways people, businesses, nations, and the environment overlap, clash, and coexist in the vast, ungovernable territory beyond our shores? How can we engage people in these stories and convey a sense of urgency about the enormous human rights and environmental crises that are playing out at sea? How can narrative and investigative techniques complement each other in environmental coverage? To discuss these questions, we're very lucky to be joined by Ian Urbina, the executive editor and founder of the Outlaw Ocean Project, a nonprofit journalism organization that produces high-impact investigative stories about lawlessness at sea and the diversity of environmental, human rights, and labor abuses occurring offshore around the world. The Outlaw Ocean began as an award-winning series in 2015 in the New York Times, which later formed the basis for Ian's New York Times best-selling book by the same name. The book was based on more than 5 years of reporting, much of it offshore, exploring lawlessness on the high seas. Today, the Outlaw Ocean Project produces written, audio, and video stories that are published in partnership with news outlets around the world. Ian started his career in journalism at the New York Times, where he worked as a reporter on the Metro desk, as well as the Mid-Atlantic bureau chief and a senior investigative reporter for the National desk. In 2009, he and fellow New York Times staff members won a Pulitzer Prize in breaking news reporting for their coverage of a sex scandal that resulted in the resignation of Governor Eliot Spitzer. Ian's work covers a wide variety of topics, from coal mining disasters to prison labor to human trafficking at sea, but a common thread is a focus on worker safety and the environment. Ian is also a contributing writer at The Atlantic and The New Yorker. We hope you enjoy this conversation and will continue to join us throughout our series of Symbiosis activities. Ian, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So I want to start with a question about maybe not the beginning, but a beginning. And I want to ask you kind of when and why you started reporting about the oceans.
So I was on staff up until about 1.5 years, 2 years ago at the New York Times, and I was an investigative reporter. And my job was to come up with topics that could sustain new and riveting international topics over the course of 2 years, usually. And ideally, investigative reporting is a branch of journalism, as you know, that focuses on things that are broken, shining a light on them in the hopes that they maybe will be fixed. I had worked offshore in grad school as an anthropologist and knew there to be just rich narrative and possibility and dark things going on offshore. And so in 2014, I sat down with my editor and said, what if we took readers out to this space and sort of broaden their awareness of all the things that happen out there?
Yeah, and so, I want to talk a little bit about that because it seems like a challenge taking readers out there because as you write about, the oceans are this hugely complex area that are largely ungoverned and ungovernable. Many of us understand very little about the ocean or maybe think about it very little in our everyday lives. So how were you able to kind of bring readers out there into this territory or area that they may, understand very little about?
Yeah, I'd say several things. One, the allure of it journalistically is exactly what you just said, which is that it's virgin snow. It's hard to find topics that truly feel new and that aren't trodden because, the democratization of journalism means there's everyone everywhere. But out there, not so much. So if we could get out into that space, especially on the high seas, especially in the fishing industry, and spend time, then we thought the stories would sort of manifest themselves. Like you say, the logistics of getting out there, there are two issues. One is the logistical challenge of getting into the space and the reporting challenge of getting folks in a pretty insular, provincial, skeptical tribe of people, seafarers, like cracking into that space, getting out into the space is one challenge. And then the next thing is the writing challenge of if you're a radio broadcaster and you go to Saturn, you're trying to tell your listeners what that place is like and they have no frame of reference. That's tough from a writing explanatory point of view. So yeah, the logistics were hard, just took a lot of time and kind of scrappy ingenuity and a lot of travel, going to different port towns and trying to talk with different captains to get out onto ships. And then the anthropological, psychological challenge of cracking into the community is also time, being fluent in their world, in their language, being respectful and transparent about your goals, and then just not rushing it.
Yeah, so you mentioned the importance of being respectful and transparent about your goals. Like, what does that actually look like when you are in the field and interacting with folks that you're interviewing? Or
you froze.
oh,
And now you're back. Okay.
Okay, sorry about that.
Yeah, I heard you though. What that looks like is, in at least how I attempt to do it, is number one, doing a lot of homework before you approach these people. Let's say this is, for example, the captain, a Thai captain in the port city of Songkhla in southern Thailand. Your goal is to convince him to take you out and maybe even let you stay on his ship or talk you onto another ship to go out even further and further. And your goal is to write about the gritty, dark, abusive universe of work on those vessels. Okay. So first thing I would do is read everything I can get my hands on about the issue and the perspective of the captain, the perspective of deckhands, and really become as fluent as possible in what might that captain believe, feel, fear, and be motivated by in doing some of the things that we consider bad. Murder, beatings, human trafficking. Why, from their perspective, might they feel able or it necessary to do those things? And so trying to crack the code on that before you walk up to the captain is pretty key, because oftentimes the captain can't argue his own case. He's a client that isn't his best lawyer. And if you're able to speak his language better than him and say, hey, look, my impression is that there's a lot of violence on these ships. My impression, though, also in talking with other captains, is that it's a pretty fearful place. There are only 4 of you, captains and officers, and there are 25 of them. You're older, they're younger. You're outnumbered clearly, and you're in a place where mutiny is possible. Again, had I not done a lot of reading beforehand, that wouldn't have made sense. And the notion that fear of mutiny is what often motivates performative violence, even murder, so as to lay down the law early, that if you guys even look cross, you're going to pay a heavy price. So trying to figure a lot of those things out before you sit down at a bar with that captain and slowly cultivate him to let you come on board is key. And then just using the right terminology. You don't sit down and say, I want to do a story about human trafficking. That won't compute, or sea slavery. But I want to do a story about the sort of the challenges of your work, why it's important, why it's difficult, why people don't understand it, why bad things happen in lots of different directions. Captains do bad things, deckhands do bad things. You just kind of lay it out there in neutral terms. And that's as best as I've found, 30 years in of doing this, in terms of tactics that get folks to let you on board.
Yeah, I mean, when I was reading a lot of your work, one of the things that I was struck by was kind of this idea of like kind of this nuance that a lot of times we look for heroes and villains, but it seems like a lot of the folks in the stories that you're following are people who are operating either outside the law or in the absence of law. And like the narrative is not as simple as a hero villain narrative. And so at the moment to like sit down and write these stories, how do you go about kind of conveying that complexity and nuance?
Well, I mean, I guess I sort of start with a methodological assumption about people, whether it's you and me or a character in a story, a deckhand shackled by the neck and a captain, you know, who shackles him. I sort of try to start with the assumption that we all are multiple characters. You know, we wear lots of different hats, and the culprit might also be the perpetrator, and the hero might also be an idiot, and you know, the villain might be a genius and empathic, you know, character in certain ways. Like, so if you start with the assumption that contradiction is common, maybe even the norm, and multiplicity is true to most people, then you kind of already, in my view, start out with more flexibility and accuracy in your approach. And then you start thinking, okay, if each person has some humanity, they're not just a cookie cutter evil character, where might that humanity reside? Well, this guy's a father. Yeah, he killed that guy and for no reason. But like, what's his backstory? You know, these sorts of questions that force you to find material that help you round out the character.
Yeah, and so I mean, I think that's really compelling, and I want to, I mean, the sort of writing, in order to convey that complexity, you have to have like so much access, and I know that that's a big part of your work. I mean, to write your book, The Outlaw Ocean, you spent 5 years reporting, a lot of it offshore. How do you get the access that you need to be able to convey some of the deep human-centered narratives that you work on?
I'm really pushy and persistent. So I bug people for long periods of time, is the truth. I try to be super transparent, like I said before. I try to really do a lot of homework, and I try to sort of always assume that no is not an option. It's kind of how and when and where, you know. But and so there's some sources that I'll, you know, kind of politely pester for a year and a half before they finally acquiesce. So you do really need to have an outlook with some of these sorts of stories that this will take a long time to produce, um, and I think also going there, um, it carries a lot of weight. So wherever the there is, um, seeing people face to face, um, reading them in person, their body language, all that other currency that you don't get in email or on the phone. Um, the gesture of visiting people, even just to ask them their permission to visit them again, you know, like really painful trips. You know, like, oh, okay, I'm going to be gone for 3 days just because I'm going to take this guy out to dinner. It's like, you know, in the busy world we all live in, that feels like so unnecessary. Couldn't I just get on the phone? And yeah, you can, but your batting average is probably gonna be a lot lower, you know. So I think, and then I guess other things I would say, I don't know. I think always assuming that, well, I'm shocked often by how willing people are to talk. Um, and I think as a journalist, it's important to constantly remind yourself that there's a good chance, for reasons that you may not even understand, that people will talk to you. If you start with that posture, uh, you might be less nervous and more daring in reaching out to folks that first time or that 20th time, because you have that assumption that I think this person does want to talk. I just think it's going to take a process.
Yeah, and so I mean, talking a little bit about that process, a lot of the reporting that you do requires interviewing people who have experienced or are experiencing a lot of trauma, whether that's, incarcerated people, migrants, folks who are in brutal living or working conditions. So what sort of processes or tools have you developed to, most responsibly interview folks who have experienced or are experiencing that trauma?
I mean, one thing I do, and again, this is all, I don't claim to be an expert in this profession. I feel like I'm still learning how to do it, and I've been doing it a long time. And I say that genuinely. Some days I feel super novice still at it. And a lot of the tools I use are sort of homemade, things. I didn't go to journalism school, and most of my learning happened in the job with just good editors who would have these kind of conversations. And one thing I do find is really important and helps get the conversation started, but also protects both parties in the long run, is starting out with a really sober laying out of, again, what my goal is, and what and sort of an attempt to manage expectations from the other person in the chair in front of me. So let's say I'm talking to Lang Long, the guy who's shackled by the neck, for multiple years, and he's only been back on shore after being rescued a week and a half, and he's a deeply broken human being. A very high stakes interaction to be entering into any kind of conversation with him, much less one about his trauma. First thing I do is thank really clearly for the trust, the blind leap of faith that he's showing in talking to me, a total stranger, and giving me some of his story. The next thing I do is say, here's why I think you giving me your story may, in the best of worlds, play toward a larger good. And I really try to explain that out. These are the various services your story is providing to other, potential targets of this type of abuse, and the various stakeholders, people who eat seafood, the Thai government, et cetera, right? And if I can do a good job in rendering your story, Lang Long, then the world, quite likely in a small way, will be a better place. Here's what will probably not happen from you talking to me: a movie deal, a book deal, money coming your way, laying out all the things that you and I might know because we've been in the milieu of journalism and we've imbibed the norms. But if you're talking to folks in other worlds, they have no idea, wait, so I'm getting paid for this interview, all this is going to change my life. You're part of the government, you're not part of the government. This is private, this isn't private, all these things, starting from the assumption that none of that is known, and saying, okay, I'm going to write a story. That guy's going to take pictures. We're also going to take video. We're going to put it up on a website, also in print. I'm going to try to do a really good job at, rendering what happened to you, et cetera, walking it all through. I think those things are really important for ethical handling of trauma.
Yeah, no, I think that's key. And a lot of your writing looks at how, increasing environmental crises are exacerbating human rights crises at sea. And so it seems like another place where it's hard to strike a balance, because you want to convey a sense of urgency to your readers, but at the same time, it's very easy to fall into like helplessness and kind of a throwing up of the hands. So I wonder kind of how you navigate that, balancing the sense of urgency with also like a drive toward solutions and actions.
Yeah, I mean, I don't, this question, for obvious and good reasons, comes up every interview, right? And I don't feel 100% confident in my answer. My answer is that when I assess a situation, so let's say I'm doing a series on coal workers or sex workers or teen runaways or garment workers in Bangladesh or traffic deckhands on the South China Sea, the first thing I'll think about is, okay, what's the lay of the land? Like, how many stories are out there, and what are the narratives in those stories, and how aware is the public of this? And is and what's the balancing equation between respecting privacy, for example, of the sources versus trying to humanize those sources and make them known and seen and have a name and family. Um, uh, and then same thing, okay, is the problem out there in the public at large a lack of awareness of what's happening in this space? Or is the problem out there too much awareness and a demoralization? In some realms, I think it's too much. In other realms, I think it's not enough. In the outlaw ocean, I think it's not enough. I think there's a real lack of consistent spotlight on and understanding of what happens out there. Like there are very few reporters doing this consistently, and the general knowledge of the bad stuff happening out there fits in a narrow. It's Somali piracy and the BP spill and ocean plastic and dolphins getting caught in tuna nets. Like that's the range of. And so for me, the bigger problem isn't overwhelmment with negative news. It's a lack of attention or awareness of bad things happening. So that's point one. So I lean that way in general, but especially in this topic. Secondly, providing a sort of concrete lists of what can you do as an average person, I think is valuable but risky as a journalist for reasons you can guess. Like that you're now getting very close, if not crossing the line, into advocacy. So my call on that is it's worth putting tools on the table and having your readers choose for themselves. But I don't sell any single tool. I just say, hey, look, my job is to vet all that's out there and give you my honest opinion of things that seem stronger and weaker. And here are the organizations and tools when I talk to people that know what they're talking about and I vet them. Here are the ones I'm pretty convinced by, seem pretty compelling. But you judge for yourself. And I put the tool on the table. And that's where that line is for me.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And you mentioned the need for kind of a consistent spotlight on these issues offshore. And that seems to be kind of one of the objectives behind the Outlaw Ocean Project, which is the nonprofit that you founded and direct, kind of based on the original reporting for the New York Times series and then your book. So I'd like for you to kind of take us back into kind of the impetus behind founding the Outlaw Ocean Project, and then also your biggest aspirations for the project.
So I produced the series in the New York Times for 2 years. Then I took a 2-year book leave and went back out to sea and produced the book. And then I went back to the newspaper for a year and just couldn't kind of put the issue down. So I left the paper and I had 3 goals or ambitions. One was I want to just stay with this topic, the intersection of human rights, labor, environment at sea. The oceans cover 2/3 of the planet. So that's a huge geographic real estate. They're really good stories. Not many people are covering them. So topically, one goal. Second goal was I want to distribute it in a different way, because I think if I really want to drive social change with this journalism, then I got to break the mold of exclusivity, and giving a story that has high impact to one venue, whether it's the New Yorker or the New York Times, means that just those readers get it. So I want to blow up that rule. It's not in the public's interest. It's not in my interest as a journalist. So I'm going to buck that. And the way we buck it is we say, look, keep your money. We're going to own our stuff. We will fund our own reporting. You publish it if you like it, but you don't pay us for it. We're going to fundraise through donors, readers, philanthropy, art projects, and we'll cover our costs. But you get the content, but you don't own the content. And then by us maintaining ownership, we translate it into 12 languages, and then we put it in 40 venues, Der Spiegel, BBC, The Economist, The Washington Post, all over the world. And suddenly a story that might get 500,000 or 1 million readers gets 10 million, in lots of different demos. Okay, so that's the second big goal, was to do that. And then the third goal was let's give the journalism a longer lifespan by converting it into some other medium. So let's take the written word and the still photography and the sound and the video footage, and let's like put it in all the venues that run that kind of content, and then let's like change it and turn it into music or a podcast series or a video game or an animation series. Often with art, let's like transform it. And the reason to do that is twofold. One, threefold. One is when you transfer it into art, you access people in a different, more emotional way, sort of apart from rational. And so it's getting at people more viscerally. Number two, you're getting at them on different platforms. So we've converted, so with the music project, for example, we have 500 musicians, from 60 countries, 90 million listeners. We take a story, we take the sounds in the story, we work with a musician, hip hop, classical, electronic. We put out an album together. It goes up on Spotify or Pandora or Apple Play or YouTube Music, right? These are not news platforms, they're music platforms. So all of a sudden you're bringing news into a space where it isn't normally, and you're getting at different audience, younger audience, more global audience. So that's like the second big thing. Or is that the third? So those are the main goals: was stick with the topic, get it out further by working with a lot more partners, and transform it.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And I think it also like speaks to these different platforms and ways of storytelling also speak to like how enormous the ocean is and complex it is, and like making people understand it in different ways and bringing them in different ways, not just through writing, but through music, through educational games, through video. I mean, I think that's really powerful. And I want to ask you if you can, because I think a lot of people will be curious what it actually feels like and looks like to report offshore. You who've spent so much time offshore, what is it like?
Gross. No, I mean, look, I mean, the space itself is otherworldly, so let's put aside in what vehicle you're in the space, but the space itself is the closest thing to space and time travel that I can imagine. Time travel on that, you're witnessing things, sea slavery, piracy, arms trafficking, mercenaries, vigilantes that you kind of thought disappeared 200 years ago. So time travel, space travel, because you're in a spaceship. It happens to be a shipping, a fishing vessel. You're traversing this incredible distance, and all sorts of things are truly fundamentally different out there. So the light is different, how strong, how quickly you get sunburned, how blinding it might be, the strange tricks it plays on the water at different time. Your relationship with light changes because your working hours change. The air is different. Winds are wholly different when they have nothing obstructing them. Weather comes from above and below, right? Like in the sense that when weather changes, so does your floor, which is the sea, and so does the water coming down from above. So, and let's put aside the anthropology of the hierarchy on the ship. You're not in a factory where the owner of the factory is a boss. You're in a vessel where the top guy, and it's a very male, is God. They're not the boss. They are literally, that hierarchy is so vertical that they have unusual authority. So there is so much different about it. It's also it's very humbling. You feel like a ping pong ball in a washing machine. Like you feel so powerless when the elements get angry. You're like bobbing along and thinking, there's no one that can come help us. I'm hoping the ship holds together. But beyond that, there's not a whole lot I can do except hold on and ride out the storm. So in a lot of ways, it's just an amazing, awe-inspiring place.
What's the longest period of time that you've spent offshore?
It's actually a little embarrassing, because to think that many of the people I cover whether they're in merchant marine on shipping, or fishing vessels, are out there a year, year and a half sometimes. My longest is a month and a half. That's nothing, but that was a long time. I was in Antarctica.
Yeah. Yeah, but I think I mean, in comparison to a lot of other reporting work, it is a long time. And it feels like kind of the reporting that you do is immersive in so many ways, because it's not like you are going to a place and staying there all day and then you can like go home, or you can go and stay in your hotel. It's like you're in it 24/7. And so, I mean, like in many ways, you are living a part of the story. And so I wonder kind of how you think about at the point of like sitting down to write, how you think about your role in the story. Like, I know in some of your writing, you kind of do show up as a character of sorts, just like narrating to us what you're observing and what your experience is on the ship. And in other cases, you're, kind of like a behind the curtains presenter of scenes. So how do you decide kind of which approach is right?
When I wrote the book, the one thing I fought with my editor and at the publishing house and my agent, who kind of played an editor role, and my hired editor, was on this very issue: how much first person and what tone of first person. In a sort of traditional traditional cultural sense, was pretty reluctant to have any, if much, first person. They ultimately were right, but were pushing hard on more first person to establish a vicarious access. The compromise we struck was, I don't want to do any, I refused and drew the line at, I felt this kind of sentences. I was scared, I was hungry. I was like, I'm not doing that, period. I was willing to do, here's a little bit of the behind the curtains on how I got out here, what I said, sort of journalistic, showing the math, like showing, because I saw that as journalistically legitimate. Okay, but it is a immersive, as you rightly said, place. And are you doing a disservice to it by being persnickety about first person? Like, fair question. I tried to say, okay, if I'm trying to do right by the reader and right by the people I'm covering and do the best job possible explaining it, and that means probably entering the realm of feeling, emotions, senses, then can you write those things without it being my sense? Can you write it as an omniscient narrator? In some venues, no, the editors won't let you. In my book, I was my own boss, and these guys were telling me to write more first person. So they're like, yeah, that's fine, And so I really tried to play the omniscient narrator and speak with a voice of authority to say, the feeling in the room was this, like, you can trust me or not, put the book down if you don't. If you do, then, here's what the feeling in the room was. It's not my feeling, it's the feeling in the room, these sorts of moves. And I think it's important to do that because so much of this is about feeling and senses, and you have to figure out a delivery mechanism for it.
So your kind of allergic reaction to the sentence of like, I feel or I felt, was that just because you didn't want the story to be about you, or where did that come from?
Yeah, I just, and this is I don't mean any disrespect to those who do this. The memoir is a very popular and quite impressive genre. I just don't feel confident enough to write that way. And I also personally enjoy the just so calibration that entails a narrator who can be on the stage but not front stage, not center stage, is present but quietly so, and only speaks up when it's helping, but never gets close to feeling like they're speaking up because they are feeding their own ego and they want readers to know about them. That's a really hard line to police and watch, but it's a line that I aspire to, walk along.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I'm interested when your series in the New York Times came out. I mean, in 2015, right? Was it 2015?
Yeah.
So I mean, I think at the time it was kind of revolutionary. And you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but we hadn't had a lot of coverage of these topics, and it was kind of a new blank space. And so I wonder if you think like the needle has moved since 2015. Like, do you think that people are taking a greater interest and getting a better understanding of these topics?
I do. Yeah. I mean, I think it's, if you think of, you can tell I'm prone to metaphors, so forgive me that. But if you think of the war and the battles, right? The battles make up the war. The war, in this case, I often get asked, how do you win the war of the outlaw ocean, or how you solve the outlaw ocean? I always say, like, you start by not ever asking that question. Like, it's just too high an altitude to even aspire to discuss. You can win battles, like that are ongoing battles. I think a lot of battles are moving in the right direction. The war, the injustice, the lack of governance, the illegality, the abuses of the outlaw ocean, I think are pretty entrenched. But I think that journalistically, the needle has moved a lot. I talk to a lot of editors, in this new model we have. We have, almost 1,000 editors in 60 countries in lots of different languages. And they are more open and interested and somewhat fluent about these topics and stories than they were 5 years ago. And that tells you something, because they're kind of cultural mediators. I can't get a pulse on readers because I don't talk to enough of them. But, I think there are a lot of culturally relevant diplomats that are at those junctures, and they are more aware than they were several years ago of the concerns out there that aren't just marine concerns.
Yeah, I mean, that's encouraging at least. And I wonder what you think some of the biggest future areas for coverage are in this space. Like, where is your mind going in terms of the most urgent stories?
I mean, I think the climate crisis is the story of the next, as long as we have, 30 years, 20 years. But that's a big umbrella. Within it, I think climate migration is really sort of a big story that hasn't clicked as much as other versions of the climate story. And a big part of that is playing out on the water, or across the water. We have a big, year-long piece coming out about Libya and the EU handling of migrants trying to cross the Mediterranean. And it's a parallel story to what's happening at the southern border of the US, which is to say, EU on the one hand, US on the other hand, wealthy developed nation governments are outsourcing the job of keeping them away. The them away means not even letting them get to the border or cross the border, but housing and stopping them in Mexico on one side and Libya on the other side. So I think that's a huge story, and we're going to start seeing that in a lot of places, sort of proxy behavior by developed nations relying on other nations to do dirty work, air quotes here, of keeping people away. I think ocean specific topics, I think ocean plastic needs to be better tackled as a journalistic topic, because it's pretty big. Seabed mining, kind of an opposite extreme, sort of obscure, but probably going to be a big deal in the next decade because it'll produce all the precious metals we use in our iPhones and solar panels. I think the sea slavery kind of concern, abuse of, 50 million people work offshore. You never hear from them. And a huge number of them are trafficked, they're captive in some way or another. So I think those are some big stories that we're focused on.
Yeah, definitely. And so I guess, we're kind of coming up on the end of time here, but you write a lot about how so much of this area is ungovernable and so many of these problems are so pervasive and pernicious. So I wonder kind of like, what do you see a better future kind of tackling those issues? Like, is there room for optimism here, or do you think there will always continue with similar variations of these problems?
Yes to both. I'd say, yeah, I think we'll always continue. This is sort of like Borges once said, constant nearing but never arriving. I think that we will, these concerns will always exist. I think improvement is happening and can happen and will happen in many of these areas. I think the optimism that I see is what I said a second ago about growing fluency from key journalists and editors and lawmakers and lawyers and buyers and taxpayers and these sorts. I think also technology is a hope spot, in the sense that on the one hand, technology has put the extraction industries on steroids, so they're much more effective and dangerously unsustainably so. On the other hand, there's lots of technology like satellites and that are coming online and the price point's coming down, so that a lot of the problems that a lot of the core ingredients for many of the problems, whether it's sea slavery or murder or arms trafficking or dumping of oil or murder of stowaways or illegal whaling, if you can't see the vessels, you can't do anything about any of them. And so there are cross-cutting solutions that will help a lot of them, and technology is promising some of those cross-cutting solutions.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I mean, it goes back to the whole starting point of the conversation, which is just this immense complexity. And so like the solutions are, it seems similarly complex, but there is room for them. So I'm afraid that's all the time we have today, but thank you so much, Ian, for taking the time to speak with us. It's been really interesting and enriching to dig into your work, and we really appreciate you taking the time.
No, my pleasure. Great questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us in today's conversation, which is the final in our series of 8 public chats. These conversations helped us to launch Simbiosis, a narrative journalism training program brought to you by ASU's Cronkite School and Gatopardo. If you've missed any of our conversations, you can catch up on Gatopardo's YouTube page. Next up, we'll hope that you join us for a hands-on workshop on narrative journalism held in the spring, and on-site residencies in the Yucatan Peninsula held next summer. You can stay up to date on all the activities on our website or by subscribing to our mailing list, both which you can find at the links below this video. Until next time, thank you. Cuídense.